Ready to level up your leadership? This is the Growth Project. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Growth Project. Welcome to our part 2 of the audit series. You might remember late last year, I did an episode about navigating the audit process from the perspective of the person being audited. Today, we are looking at the other side of the fence, the person conducting the audit. And you'll be glad to know, or you might be, that this episode is actually in video form on YouTube. And the reason I've done that is that I'm following a presentation format, which might be useful in tracking some of the discussion points. So you can go back and forth between those discussion points and take screenshots or highlight things or whatever it might be. And you might just find it easier to navigate with a visual element as well. But if that's not the thing for you, then that's fine. Just keep on listening. Otherwise, head over to the Growth Project podcast at YouTube, and I'll put the link in the show notes as well. So let's talk about conducting field audits. Here are the topics that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with just defining what is a field audit. Let's touch back on that again. I think it's important to talk about the mindset and attitude of the auditor, because I think, at least from my experience, the success of an audit program can live and die by the mindset and attitude of the people executing the audits. We'll talk about the importance of benchmarks and standards, how pre-audit meetings might look. So we're talking about being on site with your audit subject, your crew, and of course, the safety of yourself as the auditor as well. We'll talk about balancing efficiency and curiosity. We'll talk about auditor transparency and open-mindedness and why that's so important, and I guess what's appropriate. We'll talk about something that I firmly believe in, which is the no surprises policy, and there's a few layers to that, which I'll break down. We'll talk about managing conflict and tension, but what I would say, though, is that I'm going to direct people back towards previous episodes on those themes, because it's probably too much to slip into this discussion. And we'll talk about some protocols for reporting outcomes and feedback. So let's start with what is a field audit. So a field audit can be a really effective performance monitoring tool, whether it be for a project or general operations, and they're typically programmed at some kind of frequency and sometimes conducted by different people or by the same people. So they are critical in maintaining safety standards as well as quality standards and environmental protection efforts as well. If we have established safety protocols and safety standards and targets and KPIs and things like this, and I guess I shouldn't just limit that to safety. We're talking quality and environment as well. This is a fantastic tool for tracking how we are going against those targets. And it can give us a temperature check as well as to whether we are on the right path or not. But there has to be integrity in the process for that to be effective. What I love about the audit process too, if done well, is it facilitates consultation between workers, contractors, and employers or principals. So it gets people talking. Now, I've seen different audit programs. I've led audit programs. I've been a part of audit programs. I've been involved in the executing of many, many audits, and I've been the subject of many audits as well. Everything from simple site inspections through to regulatory audits and certification or recertification audits. So there's a really wide spectrum of different auditing styles, techniques, and I guess levels of vigor. And what that's done is give me a big wide perspective of what I believe works well and what I believe does not work well. When I talk about consultation, it's the act of conducting the audit in itself can be an act of consultation, but the activities that happen after the audit process has finished can and should facilitate consultation also. Where I've seen audit programs run really well is where results of audits are to some extent made public in terms of making the general summary of findings available to the wider business and celebrating wins and positive performance, but also putting any negative findings or non-compliance findings or even opportunities for improvement or observations, making them visible to the wider business also for the purpose of fostering and promoting a culture of compliance and improvement, because that's what this is all about. It's all about fostering improvement. They do help us demonstrate compliance. Audit reports are a fantastic piece of evidence as to compliance against standards, whether they are external or internal to the business, and against legislation, compliance codes or codes of practice, Australian standards, etc. These give us tangible evidence of our level of compliance against those standards. And that is something that is really critical especially for companies that run with certified systems. They identify also improvement opportunities. So there might be things that we find that aren't necessarily a problem. They might be compliant, technically speaking, but maybe the auditor sees that something could be further improved or strengthened, or they just have an idea on how to bolster compliance. So in those cases, what's important to remember is that they are not recorded as a non-compliance just because you think there might be a better way to achieve compliance. As the auditor, our job is to inspect and analyze performance against a set standard. So you might have ideas and opinions. They stay in the category of observation or opportunities for improvement, not in the realm of non-compliances or non-conformances. So that's an important thing to do, because in my time, I think there was too much time wasted, not just for me, but from the other party also, perhaps the auditor, too much time and effort wasted in trying to recalibrate and maybe reassign some things that probably should have been opportunities for improvement and not non-compliances. So that comes down to the skill of the auditor. So what they also do is they serve as a means of early detection for any safety or quality issues. So a good, robust audit program will give us opportunities for trending, which can identify issues before they happen. But if we're focusing on early detection, a good, robust program where we're auditing regularly, consistently, it gives us really valuable data to go by. And preventing safety issues is really what we want to do, as well as identifying any non-compliances. We do want to find genuine non-compliances and observations, but we need to, again, understand the difference between the two. Now, let's start with the audit process, and in particular, the auditor mindset and attitude. This, to me, has the biggest impact on the success of an auditing program, without doubt. What we should be focusing on is achieving a collaborative approach as opposed to an authoritative approach. So we should always keep our minds focused on improvement and enhancement and development, as opposed to exercising authority. So we should identify not only adverse findings or non-compliances or observations, we should also highlight and identify positive performance. The reason that that's so important is to give management, wherever the data is going, the full picture. We just don't want to send a picture of doom and gloom. And you can imagine if all you're seeing is reports and the only variance outside of the tick in the compliance box are problems or suggestions or reasons why you're not doing things as well as you could. We don't want to just paint that picture. We want to paint the picture of what we're doing right and what we're doing well. What we're trying to do as auditors is establish a culture of compliance that only comes with trust. So trust is the first thing we have to build. So that starts with the attitude and mindset of the auditor. So when I say avoiding gotcha moments, I've been part of audits where you could see the attitude of the auditor shift when they realized they'd found a problem. And it was a very smug attitude, which is why I call it that gotcha moment, because it really was kind of like they were saying, got you. Now I've got you. What sometimes auditors can forget is that often we're on the same team. Okay, so it's not about finding problems and punishing for those problems. It's about finding the problems and eliminating them as a problem and finding ways to improve. So if we build a trusting relationship with our audit subjects, and we are some of the things that we're going to talk about, like transparency and integrity, we maintain these things, we will promote and enhance the compliance culture within the business. Don't forget to use your manners. This is another big thing. A big pet peeve of mine from auditors is that there can sometimes be a sense of authority that some people tend to enjoy. And that's fine. That's fine. But I think use your manners. Now, keeping in mind, part of your inspections might involve looking through people's property, vehicles, folders, paperwork, all of those kinds of things. Manners are important. So whilst you might contractually have the authority to go into someone's vehicle and look through their equipment and their stuff, I think good manners is simply something like, hey, now I need to check out your electrical equipment on your vehicle. Is you right for me to go over there and just have a look at your tools? There should never be a problem with that, and I imagine there wouldn't be. But rather than just helping yourself, okay? So manners are important. Don't forget them just because you're an auditor. Treat all crews equally and fairly. Now, I think most people don't have a problem with this, but you would be surprised what I've seen, what I've heard, what I've experienced. And I hear about this frequently, where there's a perceived inconsistency of the treatment between crews. Now, I always feed back to this kind of commentary. Do you have grounds for that perception? Or is it more the discomfort of the findings that are making you feel like you're not being treated fairly? So, and I believe that there's probably some in both camps there, but as an auditor, we should be applying the same standard, the same behaviors to all audit subjects. Okay, there shouldn't be any favorites or any perceived favorites. Now, benchmarks and standards. So when we're doing an audit, this is what we're doing. We are measuring performance or compliance against a benchmark or a standard. So the first thing is to make sure that we understand the criteria that we are auditing against. So nothing frustrates a work crew more than someone doing an audit who clearly doesn't understand what it is that they're looking for. As the person auditing, the expectation is that you have the knowledge and the skills to check what it is that you're checking. So what you should also do is ensure that the inspection tool aligns with the operational and compliance objectives. Now, this will vary very, very widely. So you might be dealing with a formal audit where we are measuring compliance against Australian standard, a piece of legislation, compliance codes, codes of practice, etc. Or it could be a certification audit where we're talking about assessing. I think I already mentioned Australian standards, actually, didn't I? So we're talking about formal audits right down to we're checking against compliance with our own internal policies and procedures. So they can vary greatly in what standard and benchmark they are pointing to. But the job of the auditor doesn't change no matter what type of audit you're doing, because all we're doing is measuring performance and compliance against these standards. So someone in the business needs to be ensuring that the checkpoints that you are ticking off in your tool are pointing correctly, that they're current and up to date, not only with the standards, but even in the auditing process as well. As the auditor, we have an opportunity to feed back to the business where something doesn't seem right. Have you ever done an audit before and there might be items on your checklist that haven't changed in 5 years, and maybe something has changed about the way people do the work and the checklist is not up to date to reflect that? I recall many times where that's occurred. So the role of the auditor in that case is to flag that to the business, make sure that they can be updated. So making sure that we are using the right tool and that it aligns with all the relevant objectives is critical. Educate the audit subjects on the criteria. So what I used to like to do is make people aware of what it is that I'm looking for. In some cases, I would even send the template of the audit to the individuals and say, this is what I'm measuring against. Now, some people used to see that as cheating. Okay. I take a completely different outlook on that. And what I see is that if they are aware of what it is that we're looking for and they end up meeting that standard, is the outcome of that still not what we're hoping for? Think about that. It doesn't matter. We're not giving them a cheat sheet. We're giving them information to empower them to make changes with the way they work to remain compliant. That's what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve compliance. So it does not hurt our purpose. This is not an assessment. It's not a test. It's not a quiz. We're not testing their knowledge. We are checking their compliance. So make the audit criteria available to them. Why not? But if not, when you get to the site, tell them, I'm going to be looking for these things, and these things. So I'm going to need to look through your tools. I'm going to need to look through your paperwork, and I'm going to be asking questions. I'm going to be looking at your excavations and your pipe jointing and your quality tests and all of those things. Just paint them a picture about what it is you're there to do. So what you need to do also is to stay up to date on the standards and requirements. I mentioned at the start of this section about the importance of understanding what it is that you're auditing against. Let's not forget that our operations are continuously improving. The business you work for will always be improving the way it does things. That's what they do. So inherently, that means our auditing standards and our auditing processes need to adapt with those improvements. So make sure that you, as the person conducting those checks, are aware of what the standards and requirements are, because they may have changed, and there is no better way to embarrass yourself than to try and uphold an outdated standard. So before you start your audit, you need to conduct a pre-audit meeting. And we're going to discuss safety. We'll talk about safety from an ongoing basis as well. But at the pre-audit meeting, so I've arrived on site I've had my greetings and formalities and pleasantries, and now we're going to talk about the audit. I'm going to set the tone at first up. So I'm going to be transparent about the way that I'm going to conduct the audit. I want to paint a picture to the person or the crew as to what they can expect from me during the day or during the time that I'm there. And I'm going to talk about some behaviors. I'm going to talk about the fact that I'm going to be transparent and I'm going to maintain integrity. So it would be courteous to receive the same in return. Okay, we're going to set the tone with regard to any potential adverse findings and talk about what happens when we find problems so that there is no fear about the process. We're going to reassure that this is not about finding problems and punishing, but the opposite, to enhance their performance and achieve better results. Okay. We are going to allow the team to induct you to the site. So that should be a part of your criteria anyway, I'd imagine. Now you might find from time to time that you're not satisfied with the level of induction, particularly from a safety perspective, that you're given by the crew. Now, this is not uncommon as an auditor to experience this. So here's what you should do. Ask questions about safety protocols. If you know that there are certain things that they should be inducting you on, start asking questions about it. So if you know that there's information that's not being passed on, ask for the information. What do I do if there's an emergency? Where should I go? Who do I speak to? Who do I go if I've got a first aid incident? All of those kinds of things, you should be asking questions. Now that would probably make, those kinds of issues, if you're not adequately inducted to the site, that's probably going to appear on your report anyway. So after you have that conversation, I would give them immediate feedback to say, look, thank you for the information, but I've noticed that I did have to ask for a lot of that information to get that out of you. So what we might do is record this down as an observation so that we can provide some coaching about how you can better induct people to your site. Because the idea is that you don't want me to get hurt. I don't want to get hurt. Let's find ways to have those conversations more effectively. Okay, so that's that. Offer the opportunity to discuss any known issues. This is one of the things that I found very powerful as an auditor. So at the start of the visit, during the pre-audit meeting, when I'm giving my briefing about here's what I'm here to do, and here's how I'm going to do it, here's what you can expect. Now, chances are that if there are any problems, I'm going to find them. What I find is a much less awkward way to have those conversations is if we have them up front. So are you aware of any issues that I'm likely to find that we can talk about now to save us time during the process and make it more comfortable? Because it can be more awkward when I find them and I have to come and ask you. So you might be surprised how many times people will offer up the issues that they know about as opposed to rolling the dice and hoping you don't find them. Give that a try. Just give it a try. I do think you'll get results on that. After all, we are trying to establish a culture of trust and compliance. So the more we promote open communication, the more the trust enhances, the more these conversations become, offer really fruitful information. It's a healthy practice. Never hesitate to stop site activity if someone's at risk. Now, if you're an auditor and you see something that's not safe on site, it is your duty to stop the activity and highlight it to protect people's safety. So that might be something where you feel at risk, or you might see some activity and another person's at risk. Remember, it's your duty to step in and do something and say something. Discuss non-compliances versus observations. So you would educate the audit subjects or the crew on what the tick boxes actually mean on your checklist. So tell them, what does compliant mean? Compliant means that everything's fine and nothing needs changing or attention. Non-compliance or non-conformance means that that particular element does not meet the set standard or the standard that you're auditing against. And you would explain that observations or opportunity for improvement, or whatever it is that your company calls it, is something that is technically compliant, but we think could be strengthened or we think could be done better. Okay, so it's important that when we're talking about the results and we're saying that we found these 3 non-conformances or non-compliances and we found 5 observations or opportunities for improvement, it's important that they understand what that actually means. So when it comes to conducting the audit, remember, the crew is there to be productive. Remember, we're playing on the same team. Now, I've been part of audits that slowed the job down to a snail pace. The crew get very frustrated because they're not making money. They're not being productive. They're under pressure to meet productivity demands. So the audit process can be daunting or frustrating just because of the pace that we slow the job to. So try and keep that in mind. We'll keep building on that point, but just keep that in mind that they are there to be productive. We don't want to slow them down too much. But you also have a job to do as an auditor, and the crew needs to understand that. So what you would do is just explain to them that, look, you've got a job to do. I've got a job to do. I'm going to try and make this process as efficient as I possibly can. So the more open dialogue that we have, the better. So I typically like to find a balance by observing the activity on site for chunks or periods of time and take notes to come back to. So what I mean is, rather than stopping the person to ask a question for every single checkpoint, what I find really effective is to observe the work for a period of time. Just watch the things that they're doing and the things that they're, if they're digging trenches, and observing those and taking measurements and taking photos and all those things. I do as much as I can in chunks. I find that what you can do is satisfy a reasonable percentage of your checkpoints self-sufficiently without having to pester anybody. And there is going to be items where you do need to pester someone, so to speak. So what I would typically do is try and get a chunk of the inspection done just from observation, and then save up a bank of 3 or 4 or 5 things that I'm going to then go and quiz the person or ask questions. Okay, so it leaves them to get good solid chunks of tasks done, and then break the disruptions into more manageable pieces. What you should do also is get curious about non-compliances. So rather than just say, that doesn't meet the standard, tick the non-conformance box, get curious as to why. Ask questions. Is there any reason why this isn't being done this way? Can you help me understand why this particular process isn't being followed? Sometimes you might be surprised and find a really, really reasonable explanation. And what that does is feed into the consultation piece that I mentioned earlier. You might stumble across work practices that have become standard and accepted practice by the business, but are not documented that way. So our role in our quality process at that point is to feed that information back to the business and say, you know what, we came across a non-compliance because what was being done on site didn't meet this criteria, but the explanation was X, Y, Z. I think we need to look at our work process. Okay, so sometimes, and it is very, very common, that work procedures are not up to date with what has become accepted practice. So the role of the audit is to find an equilibrium there and get some consistency. So we can play a really important role in making that happen. It starts with asking questions. So, and when you don't understand something, that's again a really critical time to get curious and ask questions, because again, for the same reason as before, it either might clarify to you whether there is a non-conformance or not, but it also shows some open-mindedness for you as the auditor, and it shows integrity, and it shows that you are willing to listen and understand. So that's just good practice when it comes to having any kind of conversation in the workplace where you don't understand something. We would always expect the crew that you're auditing to ask questions if they got stuck on something. So we should be held to the same expectation, I guess. So when it comes to being transparent and open-minded, this is such an important trait for an auditor. Don't hide adverse findings. Discuss them openly. So some auditors really struggle with having the conversation around adverse findings. It can feel awkward. And that's the thing about giving feedback. It's inherently difficult to do. We're human after all, so you can cut yourself some slack. But the best way to do that is to say, look, what I'm seeing here doesn't quite meet what I was looking for. So I know that it's meant to happen this way, but you're doing it that way. So I am going to have to record this as a finding. So let's talk about how we're going to correct this. So don't hide it. What it also does is at the end, let's say that you've identified 6 items, whether they are non-conformances or observations or a combination of both, rather than hit the crew with at the end, because what we're not aware of is how their perception of how things are going. Often when crews don't hear anything from the auditor during the audit process, they're likely to have the impression that everything's going really well. But if we, 1, 2, 3 hours later, come back and say, okay, well done, here's 10 things you didn't do well, that can take people by surprise. That can instigate tension and conflict. So the best thing to do is to discuss them as you encounter them. Okay, so there's no surprises. We'll get to the no surprises policy shortly, but be open to explanations and feedback on your findings as well. So sometimes they might respectfully challenge you, and we want that. That's where innovation occurs. So you should be open to any feedback and explanations. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to take them on board, but we should listen to them. We should also maintain impartiality and consistency against the audit criteria from crew to crew. That comes down to the behaviors section that I spoke about earlier as well. So about being consistent in the way that we're treating different crews. So impartiality, where that comes into it is that, look, I'm just measuring against the criteria. This isn't my opinion on what you should or shouldn't be doing. I'm just measuring your performance against the standard here. Okay. So if we just stick to the criteria, we have a good solid understanding of that criteria, we can maintain impartiality. And that's the reason why we should keep personal opinion out of your findings. So if you are confident in your interpretation and knowledge of the criteria and the standard, you shouldn't have any issues with this. Where there is a lack of confidence, opinion tends to creep more and more into the audit process. So that's not what we want. So if at any point you can't point to a tangible reason why you've come to a particular finding, chances are it's opinion, and that can't come into your report. Okay. So if you can't point it or link it directly to a standard, then it doesn't belong there. Now, I mentioned the no surprises policy. This is a test of integrity. Okay. So now the practice of hiding in the bushes. Now I say that in inverted commas, right? But I've literally witnessed this approach in my time, in my career. I have been on a job where an auditor has literally jumped from the bushes in an attempt to catch something out. I'm not sure what the intention was, but perhaps, their attempt at maintaining integrity of the process was try and avoid being seen and observe what I can. Okay. So when I say hiding in the bushes approach, I mean everything from literally hiding in the bushes right through to just turning up unannounced. Okay. Now, look, I'm not saying necessarily that there's anything wrong with turning up to a site unannounced to do an audit. After all, the idea is that we should have a level of compliance. That's our assumption, right? So it shouldn't matter, but my philosophy is that if I'm going to be consistently conducting audits, and maybe I'm going to be auditing the same 10 different crews and just rotating between them, I'm trying to establish a trusting working relationship with all of them. Now, that pays dividends in the sense that you will find that over time, they will stop trying to hide information from you. They'll be more forthcoming with problems. They'll be more forthcoming in asking for guidance and direction and advice. Your audit process will go so much smoother by being transparent. No surprises policy also means that we should be openly discussing non-compliances or observations as we encounter them. Like I just mentioned, don't save them until the end and then bombard the person with all of this negative stuff. Openly discuss it as you find it. Then basically at the end, it just comes down to a brief recap. So it's a much better way to end the experience. So what you should also do is discuss what would be appropriate and what the likely corrective actions would be. So when you draft your report, though, perhaps while you're writing your report, you might change your mind on something, or your perspective might shift. And it's not completely uncommon where you might think, look, I put this finding in the category of observation, but in fact, in hindsight, I actually think it's more of a non-conformance. I would always go back to that person and give them a heads up and maybe even provide them a draft report if those findings have changed. So again, I'm operating on the principle of no surprises. At no point in the process should there be any surprises. And I would request feedback on those findings and offer the opportunity for them to clarify things or provide evidence as to why they think, no, they were indeed compliant. So inevitably, from time to time, things might feel tense. We might even experience some conflict. Now, I'm not going to go on too much about this because you could go on for hours on this topic. Instead, go back to previous episodes around engaging with conflict, difficult conversations, managing emotional triggers, and giving feedback effectively. We'll do a quick recap though. So basically, good practice would be to ask questions to better understand other perspectives. You would use a fact-based approach. So rather than saying things like, there's issues with your safety documents, you would say, these are the things that I've found missing on your safety documents, and I would be specific about them. So always going to be pointing back to facts, not opinions or nothing vague. We're going to actively listen to their feedback and their comments. We are going to emphasize common ground. So every now and again, sometimes just resetting the tone of the conversation to say, look, this is becoming a bit uncomfortable, isn't it? But it's important for us to remember, mate, that we're both trying to achieve the same thing. Let's try and align our perspectives here. Lead by example with above the line behavior. So if you find non-conformances, don't turn snarky. Don't turn smug. Okay. Above the line behavior means that we are going to be supportive. We're going to be very clear about things we found that need to change or improve. We are also going to highlight positive performance, and we're going to have difficult conversations in a very productive manner. We are also going to offer guidance for improvement and make suggestions on how they could enhance their compliance against the standards as well. And like I said, you are going to definitely put a highlight on positive findings as well. So at the end, we're going to get everyone together on site. We're going to do a debrief. Okay. So we're going to talk about how the how the audit went. We are going to highlight the positive elements of the performance. And we are also going to recap on the non-compliances and observations. The reason that those two are so important is that people tend to be more accepting of the critical feedback if we have also highlighted some positive, genuine positive elements. But you're going to be clear about the differences between the different types of findings. So the non-conformances, the observations, and the compliant items. You are going to aim your corrective actions at root causes. Now, this is a big pet peeve of mine, and I can honestly say that I've been guilty of this when I was very early in my career in auditing. It was a very scattergun approach to corrective actions at times. So early in my time, I found that the corrective action might read something like this. The contractor must audit all first aid kits in the company. Right now, just think about the logistics of that. I cringe at what chaos that caused in the back end as a result of those corrective actions. And by the time I reached, the middle and end of my auditing career, I'd like to think that I was actually quite polished at writing corrective actions aimed at the root cause. So rather than saying you have to go and check 150 things, instead, it should say something akin to the contractor must review its first aid kit maintenance procedure. Do you see the difference? Okay, so the reason we're looking at the root cause is the root cause should, if we've identified the root cause correctly, should stem all of those issues. Okay, so you could send 100 people running in 100 directions like headless chickens. That's not productive. We should be, if we look at the root cause, we can stem the issue, we can enhance the strength of the system. That's where the failure has occurred. Let's find where the failure has occurred and focus the attention from the corrective action on that failure. We should always focus on improvement. Sometimes there can be an impression that auditors are finding opportunities to exercise authority, finding opportunities for revenge from difficult or turbulent working relationships. I mean, that's fact. I know that for a fact. People have confidentially told me that happens. I know it happens. I've seen it happen. I've heard it happening. So if that's the mindset, you shouldn't be auditing. So always focus on improvement only. So in summary, here's the overall theme of what we've discussed. We should work to establish relationships based on trust. Your life as an auditor will be so much easier if you can establish trust with your audit subjects. You need to ditch the ego. We need to leave authority at the door, leave the ego at the door. We are sticking to benchmarks and facts, nothing else. We should be supportive in terms of supporting development, supporting, enhancing people's knowledge and skills. And that's the approach we want to have, okay? Not just walking in, swinging a sledgehammer around and expecting things to get better. They won't. People will find different ways to get away with what they're trying to get away with. If we establish a collaborative relationship with a mutual aim at continuous improvement, that's what we're trying to achieve. We won't get it with the ego involved. We should be focused on transparency and integrity. This will draw better results. There's no doubt about it. This is the only way to foster a culture of compliance and improvement. Remember that success isn't just measured by audit results, but also the improvements, or mostly the improvements that follow. So an auditor should only hang their hat on the improvements that they make to strengthen systems and outcomes, okay? Not by the amount of non-conformances that they've identified or the number of corrective actions they've written. That's not how it's done. So there's my thoughts on how to be an effective auditor. I hope that you've taken something from this. If you have feedback or suggestions or rebuttals, please reach out. Please do. I'll be very interested to connect and have discussions about this topic. It's something I'm very passionate about. And I think that if we are focused on really high quality audits, then we can expect great things to happen. There's no doubt about it. Okay, so thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one. There you have it, folks. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of The Growth Project. I'm really enjoying the interaction, so please keep the messages and emails coming through. Keep an eye out for our upcoming Frontline Leader Mindset workshops at entertrain.com.au. They're in Sydney and Melbourne. And of course, you can reach out to request a private customized workshop for your team. Again, that's entertrain.com.au. That's ENERTRAIN.com.au. What would really help us send our leadership insights far and wide is 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or even just share the show with your network, family, and friends. Until the next episode, look after yourself and look after your teams.